Greetings on behalf of the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, where we are committed to championing efforts to prioritize community goals that challenge racial inequities and advance excellent student-centered public education for all New England youth. My name is Michael Williams, and I'm a program officer at the foundation, and I also happen to be a millennial. What seems like not too long ago, I was a younger person on a journey that challenged me to explore ways to create a better world through the lens of race and class. Fast forward, I find myself here. I'm a program officer at a large foundation with a myriad of personal and professional experiences that guide my work in advancing racial equity throughout the education ecosystem. Over the years, I have learned that deep personal reflection can support my growth and how I understand and experience racism. As mentioned in How to Be a Young Anti-Racist, personal reflection can interrupt the cycle of inequities that we face every day. As a new dad, and also after successfully navigating through the first year of my son's life, I have been reminded that each generation builds off the legacy of the previous one. Specifically, as it relates to advancing the socio and political context in the world that we live in, this current generation of young people is special. They have created opportunities to engage and reflect upon racial justice in ways the world has never seen. This generation has a tremendous opportunity to deeply embed anti-racism into the evolving DNA of society. When I look at young people today, including my own son, I see the promise of a better future. I also see a group of people with sharp vision that explicitly prioritizes racial equity. Thank you all for showing up today. I'm really excited about this conversation, and I will now pass it to Kara. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I think this is going to be an amazing conversation. Nick Stone is with me, and so excited to interview her today. Nick, I'm going to ask you to take yourself off mute and to turn on your video. Hello.
Oh, hey.
Hi. So I had the pleasure of interviewing Nick and her co-author, Ibram X. Kendi, a couple of months ago for my parenting column, all about their new book, which they wrote together, How to Be a Young Anti-Racist, which is based off of Dr. Kendi's original book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, written for a younger audience. And this book, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's so relatable. It's a very readable book and really essential, I think, required reading for teenagers, but also families who really want to put this at the centerpiece of their philosophy. And for this particular conversation, I have to say, I got so many pre-questions that I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then I have a list. So people are eager, Nick, to hear from you. Thank you so much for being here. And, I think the first question, though, that I would like to start with, because I think, I'm sure there's a lot of parents watching this, hopefully, who want to raise anti-racist children, but might not know, what anti-racism means. So what does that really look like? You might think you know what that means, but what does it mean in this context, in the context of your book? And how do parents begin to put that at the centerpiece of their parenting philosophy?
All right, we're starting with the big ones.
We're starting off big.
Coming out the gate. So the interesting thing about anti-racism is that it is not solely about race. I think that we live in a time and a place where sometimes we think it's going to be easier for us if we segment things out. So if we just separate things into categories, we can figure them out and get a handle on them and we'll be done. But that is unfortunately just not how humanity and interpersonal relationships work. So anti-racism is really about coming to a place where we see all races, gender identities, orientations, spaces, bodies, classes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are quite a few different subcategories listed in the book, but the goal is to see them all as equal in their differences. What that means is that there is no superiority or inferiority in any culture, any race, any space. All of those things are just equal. And I think that the way that we start as parents, because I'm a parent too, I've got a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old, the way that we start is by just talking about stuff, asking our kids questions about the world that they live in and what they see in it, for me, has been a really great starting point. My kids are very open with me when I'm asking them questions that my parents didn't ask me, because, when I was growing up, I'll be 38 in July. And growing up, there were just things that you didn't talk about because the world was a lot different. But now I find that this next generation of kids, they are hungry for this information. They want to see one another as equals. They want to live in a world where everyone has what they need. And so giving kids the opportunity to just talk about their observations is the first step, I think.
One thing that is interesting to me, just tying it back to my own life. So I'm a little older than you. I'm 44. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and you're absolutely correct. This was not talked about at all. And now I have a 6-year-old and I have a 12-year-old. And where I live, there has been a lot of, like so many places, unfortunately, there has been a spate of racist graffiti, anti-LGBTQ plus graffiti, anti-Semitic graffiti. And I asked my 12-year-old, what do you think about this? What do you make? I wanted to start to have that conversation with him.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a part of him that cared and thought that he knew fundamentally that this was wrong. And I wanted to make sure to impart to him, of course, that this was wrong. There was another part that, because he is a 12-year-old white male who had never experienced anything personally, it felt very abstract to him. He knew that it was wrong, but he also couldn't wrap his mind around how it related to him. And kids are inherently selfish, right? Their worlds are small and they think of themselves first, like some adults. So how do you make this less abstract for a child? You want to talk to them, you want to start a conversation, but it might not be instantly relatable. And my son is lucky that it has not been relatable for him yet. So how do you make it, how do you bridge that gap?
I mean, you have to make it personal, right? And when I say make it personal, I mean by connecting it to things that they do actually care about. I find that this is where fiction is a really great tool, because there are kids, I've met kids who, they'll read a work of fiction and it makes them care about things that they didn't care about before, largely because they begin to care about a character in a book. So sometimes it takes us seeing the world through the lens of someone else's experiences for us to realize how important it is to care about other people. But you're absolutely right. Like, it can be difficult getting young people to focus on anything other than Roblox, right?
Right.
So personalizing things and like talking to them about their friendships, talking to them about their experiences, making sure that identity is a part of every conversation you have. I find that with a lot of kids that are that kind of like peak status quo, the like straight white boy.
Yeah.
Frequently, they see themselves everywhere. So it's like, a lot of this stuff isn't negatively impacting me. Why should I care about it? Taking that and pointing out, okay, but what about this friend over here of yours who is not a straight white boy, who's a gay white boy? What about this person over here who isn't white? What about this person you care about on this TV show? What do you know about their identity? Helping kids to recognize the differences in identity markers and see how those identity markers impact the way a person experiences the world. That's one of the best ways that we get them to care about other people. Because yes, kids are inherently selfish, but they also like are very empathetic. I think if you give them the opportunity to be. So creating those opportunities for them to experience or think about an experience that's different from their own is another entry point.
How do you teach kids or prepare them to react in the moment if they do witness something? So my friend tells an interesting story. So there was a boy who had very long hair. He looked different than the other boys. Who was in the bathroom, and a bunch of boys said to him, "Get out of here. You're not welcome here. You look like a girl." And my friend's son, right, in the 12-year-old boy's bathroom, my friend's son is very literal. And he said, "No, this is a boy. Can't you?" And sort of stuck up for him, but he stuck up for him in such a way that it was, to his literal mind, I know he's a boy. Can't you just tell that? I don't think that he understood the nuance that these kids were actually being cruel, but he
Yeah.
was called out as being like, oh, you really stuck out for, you stuck up for him. You said that he belonged there. And I think he was just trying to be very factual and say, yes, I know he belongs there. He's a boy. He wasn't trying to make some sort of moral point. And my friend and I started talking, how do we prepare our kids to stick up for somebody who is being made fun of or ostracized or is the victim of slurs or, worse, physical violence? I mean, it's all equally bad. How do you prepare a child to have that kind of upstander reaction if they've never been in that situation before? Because I said to my own son, how would you have reacted? And he was like, I honestly don't know. And I don't want to be caught off guard. I want him to be able to stick up for his peers. How do
Yeah.
you for that?
So look, I will say as a parent, like, honestly, we got to let go of the reins a little bit. Frequently, we're not going to be able to prepare them for the things that come at them in the world, because a lot of the stuff that they're facing is stuff that we didn't face and that we wouldn't even be prepared for, right? So I think the best things that we can do as parents is teach our kids to see other people as human beings. Like, even just establishing that foundation. Just because a person looks different from you, believes different from you, moves different from you, loves different from you, that doesn't make them any less human than you are. So much of these bigotries and these like the isms, right? The racism, the sexism, the obias, the homophobia, the transphobia, all of this stuff is rooted in dehumanization. It's rooted in fear, first of all, fear of things that we don't understand and things that we don't have a sense of control over, and then fear of not knowing like what to do and wanting to hold on to a sense of power. Helping our kids recognize that, like, just because a person is different from you doesn't mean that they're less of a person than you are, I think is really a huge thing that we could spend more time doing. Helping kids to understand what it means to be human starts with humanizing them, right? Humanizing their emotions, making sure that our kids, and especially our male presenting ones, have the space to experience a full range of emotion, making sure our boys and our boy presenting kids have the space to be sad, have the space to be afraid and to express that fear, have room to like cry when they feel like they need to cry. If you are treated as less than human, or you're conditioned to tone down your own humanity, it's almost impossible to give other people the same, to give people the space to be as human as they are. So just helping kids recognize a human being is a human being is a human being. And every human being deserves to be treated with respect, to be treated with kindness, solely as a result of being a human being. At the end of the day, we all just want to be loved, and we all want to feel some form of like joy or happiness. And so that's something that we can all kind of stand together on and lean into.
And that's something that I think we talked about this in our original conversation too. I mean, this is about having a conversation with your children. It's also about modeling the right kind of behavior for your children. And it's harder, I think, now in this era, differently from when we grew up before the advent of social media. We talked about this last time, the constant barrage of violence and horrible incidents that people can tap into at all hours of the day. I think that we didn't have that kind of those negative influences weren't as constant in our lives as they might be for kids today, who can, look on YouTube or go on Instagram and see all sorts of horrible things unfolding in real time. What would you say is more challenging for kids today? And this was a question that I got from one of the attendees too, but I wanted to ask it, what has changed in the past 20 or 30 years? What's different about childhood now, versus if you were writing this book 20 or 30 years ago? Why is the world different?
I mean, honestly, exactly what you're saying, right? The difference between now and then is like, now we can't shield our children from anything, right? Like growing up, there were things that like, I didn't learn about Rodney King until I was almost 20 years old. And this is an incident that happened when I was in 4th grade. Now they have that access. They have access to that information. I honestly think the biggest challenge kids are facing is not having adults who are willing to have hard conversations, frankly. We have to do what we have to do. Well, I think part of our problem is that it's this illusion of control, right? Like we want to be able to control things. And also it's partially that, and it's partially a resistance to adjusting to the times that we live in. I know my mom is in her 60s now, but she was hyper resistant to getting a cell phone for a really long time. And like, it wasn't until like I was like, Mom, I can't let you take my children anywhere because I don't have a way to get in contact with
They
you.
track you, right?
Right. So that's what helped her recognize that, wait, okay, I do have to move forward with
Mhm.
the times as the times move forward. I think that also we don't give our kids enough credit, right? And part of the reason we don't give our kids enough credit is because we weren't given enough credit. We weren't given enough credit as kids. Part of the reason adults in our lives, our adults, shielded us from stuff because they didn't think we could handle it. But the truth of the matter is, we probably could have if they would have given us the information. Now, we don't have a choice but to accept that there's a really good chance these kids can handle the information and that we're going to have to discuss it with them instead of acting like things aren't happening and acting like things aren't there, right? 2020 was, whew, and I can't tell you the number. I have a lot of mentees, and they like cycle through. I think my oldest ones now are in their mid 20s. Um, but back when these things were happening, I had like sixth and seventh graders texting
Mhm.
me because they didn't feel comfortable talking to their parents. Yeah, that's a problem. Our kids should be comfortable talking to us as the parent about things happening in the world. So if you find yourself in a situation where your kids don't want to talk to you, you need to examine yourself. You need to examine the standards that you set, the precedent you set in your own home when it comes to the conversations your kids are and aren't allowed to have with you, and how you react when they bring you something that maybe you're not exactly prepared for. You know, like my 6-year-old came to me one day and asked me, what do you call a boy who likes a boy?
Mhm.
We had to have that conversation, right? Because he's witnessing it. And I think that we just have to be, first of all, getting okay with changes that have happened in the world. The world is not like it was in even 20 years ago. It's completely different. Like Facebook came out when I was in college. I think it was like 2005, 2004, 2005. And now there are a double digit number of social media networks. Kids
Mhm.
have secret accounts, like pretending like they don't have access to these things. We're self-sabotaging as parents. So we're going to have to just do a better job of meeting them where they are and not freaking out because they're doing something or engaged with something that we don't understand. Like, we have to do a better job of trying to understand the things that our kids are into and
Mhm.
meeting them where they are.
Think that too, parents sometimes are afraid of getting it wrong or saying the wrong thing, or, they might live in their own bubble where they have not been pressed to stretch themselves at all. And it might make people confront their own ways of living and their own mindsets.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be very challenging for people.
Yeah,
Um,
I
is
agree
there
with that.
Yeah. So it's hard. And we got so many pre-questions, and then I want to give time to Madeline and Griffin, who are both joining us, but there's some really interesting questions here. So I'm going to just
Okay.
pick a couple of them. So this is actually a really good question. How can teens help educate their parents? Because to your point, right, this is a world that we maybe did not grow up in. We were not exposed perhaps to nearly the amount that kids are exposed to today. How can teens help educate their parents?
So, okay, there's this quote. There's an educator. I heard an educator say this years ago, and they quoted who the quote came from. But like, the gist of the quote is, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. The same
Mhm.
goes like when you're a kid talking to your parents, right? Leading with questions and curiosity is always the best way to enter a conversation. I think that a lot of the time when we are trying to spark conversations, especially with people who are older than us and whose views differ from ours, a
Mhm.
lot of the time young people are coming from this position of like, I'm right and my parents are wrong. And like, you're not going to get anywhere if that's where you're starting, right? So starting with an open mind and starting with it in mind that like there might be something for you to learn from this person who is older than you and who has been on earth longer than you have. That doesn't mean that they're automatically smarter. It doesn't mean that they're automatically better or brighter. It just means that they have more experience. So being willing, first of all, to respect that the people who are older than you have been here a little bit longer, have probably seen a bit more, have had experiences that you don't know about, and then
Mhm.
leading with questions from that place, from those roots. That's one of the best ways to enter into conversation with your parents. And asking them what they actually believe, because I think frequently young people make assumptions about
Mhm.
what the adults in their lives believe. So if you are a young person who wants to have kind of, I call them courageous conversations with your parents, start with respect and lead with questions.
To that point, actually, and this is a big question, and I don't know if we can address it in, in just one conversation, but is it possible to be anti-racist in an inherently racist society? And that's a hard question.
Yeah,
And
of course it is. Like,
it is.
and I say that I like, first of all, I have to say that, like, I can't write a book about anti-racism and
This
not
is
believe that
true.
to be true.
This
But
is
of course
true.
it's possible. Anti-racism is it's a decision. It's like a moment to moment decision. In this moment, I get to decide whether or not the thing that I'm going to do is going to support a racist idea or break down a racist idea. Like, we have this really funky idea about permanence, in especially when it comes to like personhood. It's the strangest thing to me, because I'm like, the only constant thing in life is change, right? I'm certainly not the same person, and I don't have the same ideas that I had even 2 years ago about the world. So this notion that like, oh, well, the world is inherently racist, so it's not possible to be anti-racist. Well, of course it
Mhm.
is. You just, in every moment that you have an opportunity to make a decision, you make the anti-racist one.
Yeah. And this is an active process. This is not a
It's an
stagnant.
active, literally an active process. Like, you don't just
Right.
like become anti-racist and stay that way. Unfortunately, it does not work like that.
No, that is a great point. And I would love, I think that there are some educators on this call, and I would love to speak to them for a minute. How can educators speak to kids about being anti-racist? How can, from an educational perspective, how can they help and support their students?
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm going to give the same answer. All of this begins with, first of all, understanding where your students are coming from. I think frequently we enter into spaces where we're trying to make sure people understand a certain thing
Yeah.
without taking the time to figure out what it is that they already understand. Um, I find that with young people, especially the young people I work with, things stick more if they arrive at their own conclusion, which involves them having to answer questions about their position.
Mhm.
So with educators, offering space for kids to talk is huge. I wrote a novel called Dear Martin that came out in 2017, and it's dedicated to my 10th and 11th grade English teacher, because Mr. Weeks was so incredible at holding space for us to exchange ideas and to talk in his classroom, even when the ideas were problematic, right? Like, we're 16, 17, we don't know what we're talking about. Sometimes it was just like we didn't have the internet like we do now, right? Like, we
Right.
didn't have the same level of access to information. So
Mhm.
now kids are even smarter, and a lot of the time they do know what they're talking about. But to have a teacher who would hold the space for us to have these kind of intensive classroom discussions at times, that was amazing for us. Like, it was an amazing thing for me. It taught me how to be a thinker. I'm wearing a shirt. My shirt, this is Dr. King and Malcolm X, and over their eyes, it says the phrase, "We need more thinkers," because we do, right? I think for educators, if you can provoke thought in your students, you are giving them such a gift. Teaching them how to think by giving them things to think about and provoking them to think even more about the things they think they already know, that's the best thing I think we can do for young people, especially in education spaces.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to our co-teen moderators. But do you have any ideas or any advice for teenagers when it comes to having difficult conversations with their own friends? Maybe a friend said something that made them deeply uncomfortable. Maybe they witnessed something that made them think of a friend differently, and they weren't sure how to bring it up. It's hard enough. It's hard to navigate teenage friendships under the best of circumstances.
That it is.
So
Yeah.
any ideas there?
I mean, like, questions, always questions. Any question you ask me about like what people can do, the first thing I'm going to say is they can ask questions.
Yeah.
I do think that one of the hardest things about teen friendships is that they can be so volatile. And
Yes.
I understand that firsthand. But the truth of the matter is, your truest friends are going to listen to you. If they're not listening to you, you might want to rethink your friendship, right? And I also say that from the position of a person who is determined to be a good friend. One of the things that you can do is make sure that you're being a good friend. If you're being a good friend, your friends are going to be far more apt to listen to you and to want to hear what you have to say. So creating a space where your friends feel safe to say what they're going to say and also feel okay receiving feedback if they say something that maybe they shouldn't have said, or maybe it reveals some problematic thinking that they have. If you are a good friend, frequently your friends will be willing to hear you on it. And sometimes they won't be, and then you'll get to decide if you want to continue that friendship.
Can you, and I promised that I was going to ask just one more question, but I lied. I have one more. What are the stakes right now? I mean, are we at a tipping point? Why this book? Why right now? Can you say something just to contextualize this moment in time about why this conversation is so essential to be having right now?
Yeah, I mean, look, to be completely honest, I don't know. Like, what I can say, sometimes the stakes seem higher than they are. Sometimes they seem lower. If you look across the country, though, what I can say for sure is that we're in a really unprecedented time when it comes to legislation around education, especially public education. And, there's legislation all over the table across various states about like what's allowed to be taught, what discussions are allowed in classrooms. Are we allowed to talk about race? Are we allowed to talk about sexuality? There was, I think Florida is on fire, first of all. Like, it's wild, some of the stuff I'm seeing coming out of Florida. But like, I think I read somewhere, I'm pretty sure it's Florida, but there's like a bill in Florida right now where like you wouldn't be able to discuss a menstrual cycle in school at all. So like, if you're 13 or 14 and you're on your period and you need a tampon, you're kind of out of luck. Like things like that I find them a little alarming. However, I'm also a Black woman, right? So like, I've studied history inside out and upside down. And like, none of this is new is the other piece, right? When you think about, I think about my own matriculation, my like K-12 matriculation, going through school when I was a kid, and how little I learned about the history of my people, right? The history of the people who came over here on boats as enslaved persons and were made to work the land. Like, I didn't learn a whole lot about people who looked like me because those things were purposely left out of my textbooks. It's when I got older and I started doing my own learning. I went to an HBCU, I went to Spelman College, and I really started digging. So the beauty is that the information is there, right? So we have to continue to push back against some of this legislation that honestly just doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, I have so many questions. And also recognize that we can point students towards digging up their own information, and we can encourage them to do that and empower them to do that and show that to them as like, hey, you have this secret superpower where you can go find your own information, right? Like, you don't have to rely just on the things that you're learning in this school building. Go out and get more info on the things that you're interested in.
It's a scary time in some places educationally, but on a happier note, we have two amazing, inspiring students who are with us right now, and I'm going to turn it over to them, probably one at a time. Griffin, I'm going to start with you. If you can take yourself off mute and start your video. I'm going to mute myself. And I think the way we're going to do this is you each can ask 2 questions that you prepared. So I'm going to mute, and then Madeline will turn it over to you when Griffin's done. So have fun, guys.
All right. Thank you. So my first question was, it seems like a lot of media now, like I think TV shows in particular, they use a lot of like harmful language and racial stereotypes. And a lot of the time they're shows that are targeted towards like young kids. Like I said, like The Office and South Park is an example. And when it's used in these contexts, it can be really hard for the people watching it or the kids watching it to differentiate what's a joke versus what's too far. So how are they supposed to do that? And like, how can parents help with that?
I mean, this is an excellent question. The interesting thing, the two shows you named are actually pretty old. Like they were around when I was super young, right? So back then the standards were a lot different when it came to like language that was acceptable and unacceptable. So now we have there's a lot more talk around what language is harmful, what language isn't harmful, what language perpetuates inequity, what language keeps people being treated poorly, and how we stop utilizing that language. The one thing that I will say is know your own values, right? Like, I think that as young people, it's important for you to do the research you need to do to know what you do and do not support. If there's something that you don't support and it's happening on a television show, well, then you get to decide if you're going to continue to watch that television show, right? So taking the time to figure out what's important to you is number one. What are the values that I want to stand by? There are a couple of lines in Dear Martin. You can't change how other people think and act, but you're in full control of you. When it comes down to it, the only question that matters is this: if nothing in the world ever changes, what type of person are you going to be? So sitting with yourself, getting a handle on your own values, getting a handle on how you want to treat other people is really kind of the primary step in figuring out what you do and don't want to engage with media-wise.
I love that. Thank you.
Fantastic.
And then my next question is, people use terms that are trying to come, I guess, from a place of like empathy and open-mindedness, like I don't see race or all lives matter, things like that. How are you supposed to respond to that in a way that's educational, but that they'll actually listen to you? Like you're not lecturing them.
Yeah, so honestly, for most people, they think that's coming from a place of good intention, but it's really not. Like, it's coming from a place of defense. I find that when people, if I'm wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt and somebody passing me by says all lives matter, first of all, they keep going because they don't want to have a conversation. So it's like, first of all, you got to figure out who you're talking to, who you're dealing with. There are absolutely going to be people who don't want their minds changed. They don't want to engage on this stuff. The problem with things like racism is that they're rooted in belief, which means you don't need evidence that what they believe isn't true. Like, I'm going to believe what I believe, right? So figuring out, number one, who you're talking to. Is this a person who is willing to engage in conversation about, why what they're saying maybe is missing the mark? That's step one. And then step two is ask some questions like, why do you think so it's like, oh, well, all lives matter. Well, of course they do. Why did you feel the need to say that? Do you feel that Black Lives Matter is somehow taking away from all lives matter, or is it possible for both to be true? Like, having these conversations and asking questions that kind of force people to question what they're thinking and saying is a really powerful tool in our like anti-racist tool belt, if you will. So yeah, trying to get people to think about what they're saying and teach themselves a lesson is always my tactic. And yeah, and choose your battles. Like, you don't have to go take down every person expressing racist ideas you come across. Some of them, it's a waste of time. Like, and I say a waste of time, not in any sense of like they as a person don't deserve the time, but more like your energy could be used elsewhere because there are people who are just going to cling to what they believe.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for those questions, Griffin.
Thank you, Griffin. Those awesome questions. Madeline, over to you.
Thank you. So one of the things that you touched on or do so well really in both Dear Martin and How to Be a Young Anti-Racist is just like getting across different messages in very, very accessible ways. And I'm a writer. I love writing about different feminist things and trying to get those points across, but how do you do it in a way that people will listen to you instead of like some people are always going to get defensive or automatically disagree with you just kind of because they can. But I think that you do such a good job at like kind of like not kind of easing people into into different ideas. Do you have any advice for someone who would love to try and do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, the thing is, right? At no point when I'm working on a book am I thinking about what lessons can be learned from it. For me, it's always about the experience of the character. If I'm letting the experience and the emotion of the character drive the story, it's almost impossible for people not to connect with it, right? Because at our core, most human beings have the same basic range of human emotion. We all know what it's like to be sad. We all have experienced being angry. We've all experienced feeling left out. We've all experienced feeling out of place. So knowing what those experiences feel like, that's what I'm focused on when I'm writing a story. I'm going to focus on, okay, this character is in a situation now where he's in a classroom and he's being accused of lying about his ACT score. How is he feeling in this moment? And that's what I'm going to write. And it's the same thing with How to Be a Young Anti-Racist. It is a nonfiction title, but it's still just, it's Ibram's story. It's Dr. Kendi's story. It's his journey through a very not anti-racist life as a kid and learning as he got older what he needed to do to make sure anti-racism is at his core, and that decision making based on anti-racism is at his core. And so when I'm working on that story, when I was working on that story and writing that story, I just focused on him, and I focused on his emotions, and I focused on his humanity. Anytime you focus on humanity in your work, that's what's going to shine through, and that's the thing that people connect with.
Thank you so much. I love that. My other question is more about social media, because when something, when there's like a racist event or whatever happens, I like to post about those things on social media and try and bring awareness to different situations. But I always fear that my voice as a white person is going to end up being overshadowing or heard more than someone who's Black or someone who's from the community that's really being affected. Is there a way to just like always make sure that my voice is never being heard more, but still help be able to promote those different things that are happening?
No, there's not. There is no way to make sure your voice isn't being heard over other voices. And sometimes your voice needs to be heard over other voices, right? Really, the only thing that you have any control over is saying what you feel like you need to say and trusting that the people that need to hear it are hearing it. I get a lot of questions about why the main dissenter in Dear Martin is a white girl. So SJ is a Jewish girl, and she's the person who honestly speaks out the most against some of the racist ideas that the other characters just kind of spew without thinking. Part of the reason for that is because those characters needed to hear from someone who looked like them. Frequently, when it comes to issues of race and racism, there are going to be people who aren't going to take the message from a person like me. So they absolutely need to hear it from you, right? Because they can identify with you, they're going to take your word over mine. And it's human nature. It just kind of is what it is. It's not something that really bothers me at all, because there are people like you who are willing to speak up. So I'm not as bothered by the person who's not going to listen to me, because they'll listen to you. All that to say, thank you for speaking up, and thank you for being mindful. That's a really beautiful thing. But also just trust your intuition, I think that people who really do care about other people and who want to make the world better, in your gut, it's rarely going to lead you wrong. And if it does lead you wrong, there will be somebody there to help you course correct. But trust that, okay, this is the thing that I can do, so I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. And that's what I can offer. And it's a beautiful thing. So thank you for your willingness to speak up.
Thank you so much.
The
Yes.
chats are coming through saying both of you, Griffin and Madeline, asked such good questions. So you're getting a lot of positive audience feedback, which is—
You both are amazing. And I'm so glad I got to talk to both of you. Madeline, I can't wait to read your work. So please get to it. I need signed copies at some point.
Last thing, we have time for one audience question, and this is a tough one to end on, but I think it's really important. We can't gloss over this, and that is, how do you navigate spending time with racist family? And in this world, in this country, it is a polarized place, and this is something that this is a situation that a lot of people might find themselves in, dealing with family who really hold beliefs that are very dissimilar to their own. How do you navigate that?
I mean, for me, it's a question of personhood, right? So racist, I have a Black uncle who describes himself as a Black redneck. He's a real piece of work. He really is. And I love him dearly. And because I love him dearly, it's fine, right? Like it's fine for him to be a real piece of work. I understand based on asking him questions, what his background is, where he got his ideas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think that sometimes we have to kind of like pull back just a little bit. Yes, we do not want our family members to be racist and to run around spewing racist ideas. However, we also don't want them to feel isolated and unloved in our presence, right? So it's, for me, it's truly a question of like choosing your battles. I love my uncle. I'm going to continue to love my uncle, and I'm not going to stop loving my uncle because my uncle has some racist ideas. Most people have some racist ideas. If there's an opportunity for me and my uncle to have a conversation, we do. But at the end of the day, people are multifaceted. Like we all have a combination of ideas that might be a bit harmful. Like we all have our stuff. So recognizing that like, okay, my uncle has some stuff, but so do I. Like that's a really good place to kind of go from. And just do your best to move in love. Like I think moving in love opens people up to hearing the things that you have to say. I remember being on an airplane next to a guy who was very surprised that I was sitting next to him in first class. And we wound up having a conversation about why I was on the plane and like where I was going. I was on a book tour for how to be a young anti-racist. And, you know, he kind of scoffed at the title. It turns out he's this conservative Christian white man from Kentucky. But I kept talking to him. Like we just kept I just leaned into it. And eventually he let me know that like, the reason he scoffed when he heard the title of the book is because he has a 21-year-old daughter who went to college and came back. She graduated during the pandemic, so she didn't get to have a graduation. She just came back from college really angry and was just calling him all kinds of terrible things. He was like, she calls me a racist and she calls me a homophobe and she says all these terrible things about me. And I just don't understand why she speaks to me that way. So like, she's being counterproductive in her approach. But he was willing to sit and talk to me because I was willing to sit and listen. So making sure that we're holding space for our relatives, even when we don't agree with them, and that we're like leading with love, I think is the best things we can do, not only for them, but like for ourselves and for the world.
This went really fast. There's so many more questions that are coming in that we don't have time for, but I think we
Sorry,
covered
friends.
a lot. So thank you, Nick. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, Griffin. I'm going to throw it over back to Michael to close us out. But thank you guys so, so much. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Well, thank you all for joining us today for such a rich and powerful conversation. Something that I will definitely take with me is teaching my child to recognize the humanity in others. I think that's such a powerful lesson and one that isn't often looked upon in today's society. I want to thank Nick Stone and our youth moderators, both Madeline and Griffin, for facilitating today's discussion. And I also want to thank the Boston Globe for hosting, moderating, and also selecting such an important topic. Lastly, I want to thank our audience members for just being present. And it is my hope that everyone that participated in today's session leaves this space with an idea that can spark the change we all know the world deserves. Have a good evening, everyone.